You want to know why running on the treadmill 7 days a week doesn't work for you when you're trying.
Hey, Cheryl, do you want to turn your video on?
Well, for all of those that have tuned in, I'd like to welcome you to our next and Zoomerific Lit for Lunch uh, panel, continuing our theme of pandemic literature. Our guest speaker today is Professor Peter Fifield, and he will speak to us a bit about his own research now, and specifically a really timely publication that came out just in the last year, 2020, which is called Modernism and Physical Illness. You know, academic books take quite a few years to publish, so Peter is either very prescient or has very frightening powers because his book appeared just in the last year, and it couldn't be more timely or more timeless in terms of giving a really in-depth survey of how physical illness is represented in modernist literature and literature from the first half of the 20th century. What is particularly unique about his book in comparison to the existing criticism in the field is that illness in the existing criticism tends to focus on mental illness, which some of you, given your feelings on modernist literature, might find understandable. However, the question of physical illness and how it's represented by these authors in these contexts is fascinating, especially the historical context that he's looking at, the shifts in technology and global population, in culture, the vast changes that were caused and created during this time period makes looking at the social and cultural and phenomenological experience of illness, how it's portrayed, how it's experienced, really a fascinating study. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Peter Fifield. He is going to speak about his research and his current work. But first, he's going to lead a discussion on the book that we've just all been reading or are reading, which is They Came Like Swallows by William Maxwell. And I want you to know that using the chat function, you can write questions for Peter, and he'll get to those in the Q&A. So if you have a question in the write in the Q&A, there should be something that you can click at the bottom of your screen that lets you do that. So your question will appear, and we'll try to get to those as we can. So thank you very much, and a warm welcome to Peter.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be invited to speak. There is, of course, a sadness that being invited to speak isn't what it was a few months ago. Well, I suppose heading towards a year ago, it would have been nice to be there in person, but there's something oddly kind of performative about speaking to you from across the Atlantic, where we're on a kind of we have a form of isolation enforced. I've not been outside for 4 days, just been indoors reading, and your own experiences of life, I think, probably enforce that same sense of separation driven by the health agenda that we're all obeying. So as Cheryl mentioned, reading this kind of literature at this particular moment is an uncanny experience. And it was certainly uncanny when my book finally came out last year. This was work that I'd started back in, I suppose, 2014, 2015, maybe, when the idea started gestating. And I was working steadily on it. And the only kind of health crises that arose were things like SARS or bird flu. You occasionally heard things, but they always seemed a long way away. And I think one of the experiences that this pandemic has brought home to all of us is that reading literature about illness now feels a much more familiar experience. It's not that feeling of reading about an unfamiliar, a strange, unimaginable space where you don't, where normal life is temporarily suspended. Normal life has been suspended for us for a while. So I think it's perhaps easier to feel absorbed by these works rather than read them as documents of some sort of curious, long gone period. As Cheryl says, please do type in questions and I'll do my best to either incorporate them in as we go or to answer them at the end. If things seem relevant as we go along, then I'll mention them there and then. The way I think this is, the way I picture this working is I'm going to talk about the Maxwell novel, or maybe a novella, for half an hour, something like that, and then try and transition on to some of my own research and hopefully give you a bit of a kind of insider view of particularly one thing that didn't get to go in the book, just one of these curiosities, but I thought it was a fun kind of example. And so that's the more formal part of this talk, when I'm acting less like a reader and more like a researcher. So I read this book for the first time when Cheryl invited me to do this. And so I come to it with all of the background of my research, but at the same time, a certain kind of fresh set of eyes. So my research has been largely on British modernism. The book that I've published is largely about books that were written in the UK and by British authors. The exception is T.S. Eliot, who's a kind of common possession, I think. We share him between the US and the UK. So it was interesting to see how an American author responded to a pandemic in exactly the same period. Of course, the book is structured in a way that foregrounds a dialogue with modernist texts. The titles of the sections, or of the first section rather, communicates its debt to W.B. Yeats. And there's also a relationship here with several of the kind of big hitters of literary modernism, European literary modernism. I think perhaps the most obvious for me is James Joyce and particularly the book Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. In that book, we're plunged to begin with into this, into the child's eye view, his sense of the strangeness of the world and the incomprehensibility of adults. We get very similar senses of disorientation in Maxwell. I think he's drawing this directly from Joyce, particularly in the dinner scene that we get early on, where the father, James, is kind of having an argument. Politics is the subject. We also get an argument, a political argument, in a very awkward dinner scene in Portrait of the Artist, where the child's eye view really both fails to understand what the adults are talking about, but feels the emotional tension that pervades the whole dinner, the awkwardness. So I think there's a direct dialogue there. Perhaps the biggest debt or interrelation is with Virginia Woolf, who is the person I'm going to be talking about in the second half of this topic. Maxwell himself admitted to this relationship, saying that when he was in college, he was given a copy of To the Lighthouse. This was, he said this in a preface or introduction that he read afterwards, that he wrote afterwards, sorry, where he said that it was like meeting a doppelganger in seeing James Ramsay, the little boy at the centre of To the Lighthouse, because that novel as well is features a small boy who is entirely disoriented by the complexity of the adult world, and in that case the mother is a familial linchpin around which all of the tensions and the annoyances are kept safe. The child is principally protected from the father. So there's a very similar dynamic there between James, his father, and Mrs. Ramsay, his mother, and between Bunny Morrison, his mother Bess, and his father James. So the family is a place of tension. I think that's one of the starting points, and the mother is the kind of the safety valve for that, the person who keeps everything in place. Perhaps less of a human, or less of an obviously human debt, is the fact that Woolf's novel is also in 3 parts, and it's famous for being so. When she was planning this book, she pictured the novel in an H form, i.e. it has a substantial first chapter, then it has a very brief central chapter called Time Passes, and then a relatively large final chapter. So it's a kind of linked thing. And here I think Maxwell is also using a relatively explicit form to try and bring some shape to an otherwise perhaps unremarkable or undynamic scenario. So in terms of the novel's plot, that is Maxwell's plot, very little happens. And arguably the same is true of Woolf's novels. I think so. One of the reasons that Maxwell imports this 3-part structure is to provide a form to something which no longer has the ready-made form of a plot where one thing happens after another and drives a kind of story. It's not that kind of book. It's much more informed by mood and atmosphere rather than significant events. Of course, as I say that, there are significant events in the book. Of course, everybody gets influenza. But one of the oddities there is how that influenza is depicted, because it varies from chapter to chapter, perhaps in the same way as a common infection varies from person to person. At the moment, of course, we have the scenario whereby we have people who are asymptomatic coronavirus carriers. They have the illness, but they're not ill, or they have the infection rather, but they're not ill. Some people are being hospitalized and others don't even know they're ill. So that sense of the same event happening to different people and being radically altered by the kind of terrain that it lands on, I think is built into the fabric of this text in the same way that it's built into the nature of disease. But we see very little of those illnesses as they play out. So with Woolf's To the Lighthouse, Mrs. Ramsay dies, and it happens in parentheses in this central section, this small section of the book. It says, almost as an aside, that she died. There's nothing around it. There's no sense of this being a story-like event where something happens and then something else happens and then something else happens. It's just dropped in there like almost like a notice in the newspaper of someone's death. It's that brief. It's anti-discursive, really. Here, in some ways, Bess's death from influenza is similar. The thing that we notice about it is that she disappears. All of a sudden, she's gone. She goes off to have her child and then just doesn't come back. There's a few reasons for this, I think. So one is one, I suppose, is the realist reason, which is that one of the things that was notable about the influenza pandemic 1918-19 was that it was particularly dangerous for people in what we might think of as the prime of life, i.e. people my age, 30s, 40s, the people who would, in a more typical pandemic, be the most robust, the most able to withstand an infection. In 1918 and 19, these people were the most vulnerable, the most likely to be to fall ill and die. So, and that meant that it was people of a working age who, instead of being the people who populate shops, businesses, towns, institutions, there's this very stark sense of their sudden disappearance. So I know in the UK, for example, there were reports in the newspapers where people were discussing what had happened, such that they would say, well, I was playing cards with somebody last night, and then we all went home, and then they didn't come to work the next day, and it turned out they were dead. It was that sudden. They seemed fine, and then all of a sudden, they were just gone. There wasn't a protracted period of suffering in a lot of cases. It was fast, and it seemed to tackle the most, it seemed to have the most severe impact on the people who were seemed least vulnerable. I think, so yeah, that's the kind of realist reason, I think, why we see so little of Bess's death. I think probably in terms of form, the reason we see so little of it is that Maxwell's book is, of course, predominantly written from the child's point of view, or at least very close to the child. There's some play about just how close to the child we are. So we get discussions of the mother coming into Bunny's room when he's ill, and the guilt that gathers around that. But nevertheless, when she falls ill, we don't see anything of that. The child is routinely protected from the illness of their parents in the way that is not true in reverse. A part of the privilege and perhaps the trauma of childhood is to have one's eyes averted from things that are scary, damaging, upsetting. So I think a part of that obliquity, the desire to kind of look around and look past, is to do with the privileges of childhood, the torments as well. I mean, of course, that's not just it's not a simple thing to say that children aren't allowed to see their parents fall ill and die. Of course, when we do get to see illnesses, then we get three different versions of it. We get Bunny's, we get Robert's, we get James's. And it's really with Robert's that we see the most of the condition. With Bunny, we see him being taken off to bed, but it largely happens from Robert's point of view. So if we have just a brief glance at the end of the first section, Bunny's section, whose angel child, what we get is, I'll just have a read. Instead of listening to the military terms of the armistice with Germany, Bunny went and put his head on his mother's lap, for he felt very odd inside of him. He heard her say, "James, this child is burning up with fever," and he thought dreamily that it must be so. "I'm going to be sick," he thought, grateful for the cool hand on his forehead and her nearness. And after that, life was no longer uncertain or incomplete. that last line is, I think, complex and pregnant with meaning, but it is striking, and I don't think we should overlook that idea that the moment that Bunny falls ill is the moment that our gaze shifts here. That's the point at which we go to Robert's point of view, and we see Bunny fall ill from Robert's angle. So I think Maxwell is sort of demonstrating something here about the effects of illness as they happen to the people surrounding the patient, the sufferer, which I think is a perspective that we are maybe inclined to place in a secondary position. When we think about flu or think about illness, we think of the patient or the victim. That's the kind of locus of meaning. But in this book, repeatedly, that's a vacancy, and it's the ripples around that kind of that traumatic moment that are felt throughout the rest of the book. So we feel the impact of Bunny's incarceration on Robert. We see the impact on Bess, that she's desperate to get into the room, but isn't allowed into the room. Of course, this is the kind of tension that we've probably all seen endlessly in our current situation, that sense that but surely it doesn't apply to me. Surely I'm allowed to, I won't catch it. That kind of idea. The exception is, as I say, Robert's illness, and I just wanted to put up the description of when Robert falls ill, because I think it's so interesting. Let me see if I can do this. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. So this is the section where Robert falls ill. This is in section 10 of Robert's part. Robert was not hungry now. While Uncle Wilfrid was talking, all desire for food left him. "It's cold in here," he said, not expecting that Aunt Clara would get up and go look at the thermometer. "I declare, 76. Don't you feel well, Robert?" He was all right, perfectly. There was no reason why they should all be staring at him that way. "Your eyes are bloodshot. Look bloodshot." Robert pushed his chair back from the table. "No," he said, "I just thought it was cold in here." And before he could get upstairs to the bathroom, he was vomiting. Aunt Clara undressed him, as much as he would let her, and pulled the covers back so that he could get into bed. In a little while, Dr. McGregor came and took his temperature and asked him questions, all from too great a distance to be of any help. Robert was glad that Dr. McGregor had come, and sorry when he went away. But there was nothing he could do about it. He was cut loose. He was adrift utterly in his own sickness. For 3 days and 3 nights, it was like that. Aunt Clara appeared every 2 hours, now fully dressed, and now in a long white nightgown with her hair in braids down her back. Sometimes her coming was so slight an interruption that he could not be sure afterwards whether she had been there at all. Again, she stood by his bed for an indefinite time, with 2 white tablets in one hand and a glass of water in the other. So this experience, I think, is really amazingly described. And I think probably the most important thing that it communicates to us is the sense that Maxwell has a sense of the proximity of childhood and illness. I think that's the reason why we persistently get the child's point of view, that James's adult point of view that comes at the end of the novel is relatively brief. And it's the experience of being powerless, of being disoriented, of the world being somewhere which is difficult to understand, where you don't see it in the way that apparently the adults do. This is, I think, that sense of propinquity that helps to facilitate the child's eye view. there are all kinds of risks that come with child's eye view writing. It can seem very sentimental. It can seem very affected, kind of artificial and naive. It can seem kind of posturing as well. And here I think Maxwell avoids all of that with a sense that the experience of illness is to put this another way, the experience of illness is one of being made into a child again. We're subject to the world, not in command of our senses, estranged from our bodies. And that's the feeling that I think we see here. Robert was not hungry now. While Uncle Wilfrid was talking, all desire for food left him. So, I mean, a young man who is used to eating plenty, we know he has favourite parts of the chicken. He likes to eat the wing and routinely gets it. The idea of this active young boy all of a sudden not feeling hungry, I think is, of course, from an adult point of view, kind of worrying. So, oh, is he off his food? This is a symptom as we read it. But this narrative here seems to be much closer to Robert's point of view. It's said with a kind of matter-of-factness. Robert wasn't hungry now. While Uncle Wilfrid was talking, all desire for food left him. This is not about Robert as a list of symptoms. This is about the fact that Robert just doesn't want anything to eat. It's not experienced as a symptom. He doesn't feel like he's ill. And so the discussion goes on in this sense, that in this direction rather. It's cold in here. Again, we assume, or that Robert assumes rather, that the illness is some kind of external effect. It must be a cold room because I feel chilly. The idea that the adults have this mechanism for checking, is the world all not quite right? Or is this something in the perceiver, in Robert, is with this thermometer? And I think it's really telling that when Aunt Clara stands up and she goes to look at the thermometer, of course, what she's doing is looking at the thermometer for the temperature of the room. She's not looking at the temperature of the child. This is not a diagnostic act again. It's only one by kind of comparison. She knows that because the room is warm, that his feeling cold is a problem. We get this strong sense of kind of looking over Robert's shoulders with the free and direct discourse, as we call it. He was all right, perfectly. This is effectively Robert's voice, even though it's speaking with a third person. He was all right, perfectly. This is a child's kind of reasoning. Why are you looking at me that way? That sentence balances between the first person outrage of what's everyone staring at? That kind of confusion, and the third person authority of saying, let's look at this situation and see what's going on. And I think probably most striking in this same kind of vein, this sense of self-estrangement, is with Robert pushed his chair back from the table. I just thought it was a little cold in here. Before he could get upstairs to the bathroom, he was vomiting. That's a really strange kind of phrase there. It's not he vomited. It's almost he found himself vomiting. This sense of it all of a sudden coming upon him, that he is made into an object quite as much as an actor. Of course, we all recognise this from when we feel ill. Typically, vomiting is not something that we choose to do. It's something that is almost done to us by our bodies. That strange experience of almost the body taking control. We're going to vomit now. And I think that sense of before he could get upstairs to the bathroom, he was vomiting, moves us from the sense that he's chosen to go to the bathroom to he was vomiting. This is a thing that's happening to him. One more thing to point out on this slide is the sense of time's passage. One of the striking things that I think we probably all recognise from the experience of fever is where we lose track of the passage of time. It's a very familiar experience. we also get it with things like sleep and anesthesia. So things that are associated with illness and recovery and treatment. Now we get a few different voices, or the voice metamorphoses through this. We get for 3 days and 3 nights it was like that. But then we get Aunt Clara appeared every 2 hours. So we've got a very strong sense of time's passage. It's measured out in recognizable units. But then the format of now fully dressed and now in a long nightgown with her hair in braids down her back compresses that sense of time. And now, and now, and now. It's a sense of continuous presences rather than a steady unfolding. It's not, well, of course it's daytime, so she's fully dressed. It's a sequence of kind of flashes of alertness, attentiveness, where you see the visits of this woman just occurring like moments waking from a slumber, which I guess is what Maxwell's depicting here. We also get further down on this that again, she stood by his bed for an indefinite time. There seems to be at once a very strong sense of time's passage. We can say exactly how time is passing, and that time has become fluid and elusive, and sometimes things are happening quickly or slowly. Can't be sure whether you're whether she's even been there at all. So that sense that I think I'm sure we all recognise of illness not being an experience like others, but one which changes the kind of structure or the fabric of reality. It's not an experience like eating your dinner. It's a transformation of the world, the whole kind of angle on eating your dinner, when the structure of reality begins to warp. Time itself, space, one's own sense of one's body being cut loose, adrift utterly in his own sickness. This is a real sense of being separated from oneself. I'm just going to stop the sharing for a moment, just so I can see some faces again. Okay, how are we doing for time? Okay, what else did I have to say? Oh, maybe there are a few things that I'm not quite sure how to put, but just to throw these out there. The sense that we get to James's point of view when he is also bereft of that sense of control, that he too, in the wake of grief and his own influenza, becomes newly childlike. He becomes disoriented. He doesn't seem to have the authority, the control, the same kind of balance that we think of, or that we saw in the first part, that he seems to be really kind of I suppose tragic. It's tragic seeing him being kind of unmanned like this. That again, the message seems to be that there's an association between being childlike and being ill. And I'm going to move on in a moment to talk about Virginia Woolf, but she says that there is what she calls a childish outspokenness in illness. That sense that the child's lack of filter, as we might think of it, whereby kids just blurt stuff out, regardless of whether they should or not. That's one of the effects of illness too, that we seem to be deprived of that poise, control, restraint that we associate with adulthood. And of course we see James wrestling with exactly that he's loses control, I guess. Maybe a last thing, or two last things just to mention, and I guess they're almost as much questions as they are points, is the relationship between disability and illness. I think is really foregrounded in the book, that Maxwell's older brother was like Robert, lost a leg when he was a child in an accident. As you will know, it's a largely autobiographical novel. These two things have a slightly awkward relationship in a lot of books, because I think, as disability studies might teach us, that disability both is and isn't like illness. Disability is just another version of normal. It's unremarkable. It's the everyday. But at the same time, that sense of being repeatedly shown the limitations of one's agency, the frailty of one's body, having one's agency frustrated. These are experiences that are the most familiar to us from experiences of illness. So Robert's, there's the wonderful section where Robert is imagining that there is a treatment whereby he can grow a new leg. This heroic medicine is going to be imagined, and he's going to grow a new bone that comes out of his leg, and it'll be sore when it gets to the knee and really hurt when it gets to the foot, but it'll be possible. That this seems to be experienced something like a desire for a kind of cure. You know, the idea that disability is cured, I think, is one of these. Is here the way in which disability and illness are kind of tethered. There's this idea of a medical intervention, Dr. McGregor, or the specialist unit that Bess goes to give birth in. Yeah, I think lots more to say there. I don't feel like I've got a clear take on that. But the last thing is the relationship towards the war here. The novel is set in the immediate the final couple of months and the immediate aftermath of the First World War. So a lot of the location work that we find in that early chapter is done via significant historical events. So the signing of the armistice in the section that I read at the end of Bunny's section. But in many ways, the war is this other world out there. The idea that Bunny is being exhorted that he should remember this moment because the armistice is a historical moment with a capital H seems so out of place for this very strongly kind of domestic scene, a domestic drama. And I think the other version of this story that's going on is of course, Bunny has a Belgian village that he is kind of semi-imagined out of jewels and bits and pieces. Children have treasure, like that kind of thing that you use to imagine. Belgium and the Belgian village is exactly a kind of a marriage of this domestic scene, the familiar, i.e. he plays with dolls and towns, but it also has the mark of the war and the fact that Belgium was seen as the principal victim in the Second World War of outrageous German aggression. That really, if their war was with France, they should have attacked France. They shouldn't just march through Belgium. And that Belgium is also kind of sacrosanct, that it was the symbol of European peace. 99 years before since there'd been a mass European war with the fall of Napoleon. Yeah, so I think the war here has a kind of ambiguous function. It seems like a kind of marker in history, but also it's, I think, repeatedly shown its difference and almost its irrelevance to the kind of suffering that's taking place here, the kind of grief which is so localized. Okay, well, I think with that, I'm going to move on from Maxwell and just talk to you a little bit about my own research. Do I have any questions here at this moment? Well, I think I might answer Bonnie's question here first. So Bonnie has written, which character, in your opinion, was most impacted by Elizabeth's illness and death? So I think while we're with Maxwell, I think this is the right time to address this question. So it's very hard to compare grief. I think one of the things that the novel is doing is showing us the incongruity of experiences, even of a common event. And I think that also goes back to the discussion about the war, that here is a significant event, but its impact, its meaning for its participants, its onlookers, is radically different and, in fact, incomparable. So I think to say who is the most affected by Bess's death is to start in the wrong place, I guess, where I think we have these three versions of the same event, which are in some ways incomparable. They have common elements. Each of the men feel guilty. The boys, Bunny, Robert, and James all feel guilty. They feel some kind of personal responsibility. That grief seems to be, I think, profoundly connected to a sense of cause. What did I do to make this happen, or what didn't I do that I could have done? So we have James grieving over the fact, is it the interbus? Is that what it's called? I can't remember, but yeah, that he made Bess go on this, and that's where she could have contracted it. We get Bunny's guilt that he let his mother into, Robert's guilt that he let Bunny into his mother into Bunny's room when Bunny was ill, and that it was his job to kind of keep her safe. So guilt seems to be a kind of common element that runs across all three. But this woman was clearly different, a different person for all of them. Those of you who have had the misfortune to be bereaved, I think will have probably had that revelation that even a common bereavement is at the same time the loss of several different people. And I think that's one of the things that's happening here. So Carolyn's question is about Mrs. Dalloway and Woolf's essay on being ill. That is exactly where I was planning to go. So that question might still be valid in a bit, but I'm gonna start on my sort of second half. So I'm going to go back to the display and share my screen. So, Woolf wrote the essay on being ill in late 1925 in response to an invitation from T.S. Eliot to have something new for his quarterly, The New Criterion. It came out after a bit of tussling and frostiness between them in January 1926, and like the good journalist Woolf was, she wrote a shortened version that was published in April of the same year in another publication called Forum. And then she tidied up the first version and published it on her own Hogarth press as a freestanding pamphlet in 1930. She also used a part of the same idea in an essay called Gas in 1929. So we've got essentially 3 or 3.5 versions of the same essay that she published in different places. So one of the starting points is, don't let anyone tell you that modernists were elitists or aristocrats who are scornful of the material world and the basic concerns of money and labour. You can tell a professional writer because they get every bit of juice out of the squeeze. So here's the opening line of the essay. And as you can see, it's a whopper. So I'm just going to read this. Considering how common illness is, how tremendous the spiritual change that it brings, how astonishing when the lights of health go down, the undiscovered countries that are then disclosed, what wastes and deserts of the soul a slight attack of influenza brings to view, what precipices and lawns sprinkled with bright flowers a little rise of temperature reveals, what ancient and obdurate oaks are uprooted in us by the act of sickness, how we go down into the pit of death and feel the waters of annihilation close above our heads and wake thinking to find ourselves in the presence of the angels and the harpers when we have a tooth out and come to the surface in the dentist's armchair and confuse his rinse the mouth with the greeting of the deity stooping from the floor of heaven to welcome us. When we think of this, as we are so frequently forced to think of it, it becomes strange indeed that illness has not taken its place with love and battle and jealousy among the prime themes of literature. Now, I have to say, as someone who asks students to write essays and often instructs them how to do so, I feel something of a fraud when I tell them that they should begin directly with a short and to the point sentence. This is one of the reasons I don't like giving sample essays. What if they find something like this? So this is a fantasy for Woolf of transportation. One thing leading to another, in a chain that feels like it could go on forever. It's not an ungrammatical sentence, and I don't think we're really at risk of getting lost. But it is complex. What begins as a well-punctuated sentence gradually sheds its commas as it becomes one swimming mass. And this signals that something special is going on here. This isn't a kind of disquisition kind of essay, but something much more performative, much more artistic, I think, than that. It's questionable, mind you, how much of an illness narrative this really is, because while she refers to fever opening new observations, it seems to me more of a medicine narrative. The form is imitative of the woozy, semi-conscious drifting of someone in and then coming out of an anaesthetic. Now, it's pretty unusual in the UK these days to have general anaesthesia for dental treatment. And of course, there's probably something to be said here about the nation's comparative reluctance to go to the dentist for fear of getting treatment there and then with no general anaesthesia. But you probably only get general anaesthesia if you were having, say, all of your wisdom teeth removed in hospital. And that probably wouldn't be given by gas. But that's just what's going on here. Woolf is getting high as a kite on gas, which was notorious for giving you a colourful sort of visionary experience. It's not the boring blackout that we might now associate with surgery. There's lots to say about this sentence, but a few things are especially important. First is the attempt to document a limit experience, that is, something on the edges of consciousness, where the way in which we habitually see the world is suddenly thrown out of joint. That human experience might be richer and stranger than we usually give it credit for is a central tenet of the writing of the early 20th century, what we call modernism. So if we really pay attention, the idea goes, we see that there are new and unknown, unfamiliar aspects of that make up reality. We only need to pay attention. Second, and connected to this, is the idea that this material is beyond the reach of the conventional literary approach. So one of the reasons that this material is neglected, Woolf says, the reason that the illness hasn't become the prime theme of literature, is that it's resistant to the habitual ways of writing. A narrator who thinks there's something important to be found in confusing the voice of the deity with the voice of the dentist, and one can assume the relationship between the mouth rinse and the Eucharist as well. There's something slightly sacrilegious going on here as well. Elsewhere in the essay, just to throw in here, she refers to illness as the great confessional, that idea of it eliciting a kind of openness or a confession, bringing a kind of new self-awareness to ourselves. That is, she's suggesting that there's a benefit to having a speaker whose focus lunges slightly unpredictably, out of control even, from one object to another. That seems to be what's at stake here. So, as the essay moves on, we can see the sense of chaos as it's, kind of roiling tumult, as the essay continues. So with each breath, one draws in confusion, one draws in darkness, falling, scattering like a cloud of falling soot flakes. And also one puts out to sea. With every breath one leaves the shore, one cleaves the hot waves of some new sulphurous dark existence in which one flounders without support, attended only by strange relics of old memories, elongated, stretched out, so that they seem to parody the world from which one brought them, with which one tries to keep still in touch by their means, as the curved glass at a fair makes the body seem tapering and then bloated. As we read this, you're probably thinking, are we breathing, or are we riding a kind of volcanic cloud? Or maybe we're on a sea voyage, or is it a memory sequence? Or is it a kind of literary form, the idea of parody? Or is this a funfair's hall of mirrors? This run of images, and the run is, I think, itself what anesthesia seems to be like, is not to be the choice imagery of the sober, clear-eyed author reflecting on a disorienting experience, but the experience itself, moving kind of sideways, one image following the next in an unpredictable and kind of visionary way. It's something we might even associate with the kind of romantic drug takers of the late 18th, early 19th century. So to be ill, it seems, is to lose contact with a recognizable world, governed by the rules of good sense and order. It's to throw out the descriptive rulebook and come at things from a totally new angle, or indeed 3 or 4 of them. Woolf becomes much more explicit about the nature of the challenge as the essay continues. The descriptive challenge of illness is the same sort of challenge we recognize from other versions of modernism. That is, it's caused by what she calls the poverty of language. So this is a recurring idea that we find in all kinds of domains in the early 20th century, this idea of language being in a crisis. It's now falling short, or it's suddenly worn out, that something that was once effective, where words and their reference seem to work together well, that now it's not quite doing the right thing anymore. It doesn't seem to map onto one another in that same way. So rather than, and it's the lack of a canon of illness making that can make us feel all of this. So rather than have illness as just one more theme among many, of all of the many things a book can be written about, that we can do anything fresh. What new things can I write about? That is, how can I freshen up maybe the old tropes of a love affair or jealousy? Instead, Woolf seems to be describing illness as a kind of agenda-setting topic. It has agency, it deprives you of agency, but it makes things happen and it demands novelty. So she describes how the writer of illness will be a kind of free thinker, forced to coin words himself and taking his pain in one hand, a lump of pure sound in the other, as perhaps the people of Babel did in the beginning, so to crush them together that a brand new word in the end drops out. So teasingly, this is, Woolf suggests, not a viable option for an English writer whose deference towards the language prevents the sort of radical inventiveness that she's describing here. But rather, she says, in I think what is one of the most English of double-edged comments, to Americans. She says, Americans whose genius is so much happier in the making of new words than in the disposition of the old. So she might be slightly snobbish. The suggestion she makes is that the great literature of illness will be one that comes from abroad to set things aflow. So it's not just shade, like she's also flattering this idea of novelty and the energy and the freedom as well of American writers being able to transform, to overhaul this language which has kind of fallen sour. The third thing I want to flag in the essay, the illnesses that Woolf lists are physical. They all have, of course, a psychological component. I'd say, of course, having broken my arm not so long ago, even a broken arm is experienced in my mind. When it feels like it hurts in my arm, that's all happening in here. So everything takes place in the mind, but these are the everyday kind of illnesses that she's interested in: colds, fevers, toothaches. Woolf's sense here is that it's the body's resistance to language that makes these conditions such a challenge. It's not the neuroses or psychoses of mental illness that compel artistic production. It's the body and its commands. And it's in illness that the body reveals itself as a perceptual medium, as well as an object of perception. So it's not, as she says, a sheet of plain glass through which the soul looks straight and clear. Instead, she says, all day, all night, the body intervenes, blunts or sharpens, colours or discolours, turns to wax in the warmth of June, hardens to tallow in the murk of February. The body comes between us and our surroundings then, and it affords perceptual access to the world and at the same time dictates the terms of that access. It is, as the quotation concedes, vulnerable in turn to the effects of that outside world, turning hard and soft in response to the environment it lives in. This is not only an argument for stained or warped glass rather than a sheet of clear material then. Woolf asserts that the body is literally and metaphorically malleable. It changes, and it changes what we can perceive. It changes who and what we are. The body isn't being invoked here as a blunt, uninteresting kind of stuff, incapacitating a brilliant mind. It's not that story of the great mind being struck down by a tragic illness and sadly they can't write anymore. Absolutely the opposite to that. Illness is the condition in which we're reminded what the body is, which is to say what we are. So a complex system of feedback and self-reference that, like the weather, summer to winter, is endlessly changing and fascinating. I realise that that's at an hour, but I've got more stuff and a slightly left field element as well. I wonder, should I continue with this, or I'm not sure how long you wanted me to continue for. I have more things to say about teeth, which is pretty unlikely. Yes, more teeth, says Cheryl. Okay, right, good. I was hoping that you were going to say that. So obviously the starting point for Woolf's On Being Ill is this sort of trip to the dentist. And you think, okay, well, this is just a random example. But this is not the case. I think there's something going on with Woolf and teeth. And this is not just a kind of English discomfort about how grim our teeth tend to be. That I think instead, there's something here about experiences that she had that lead us on to this real historical curiosity, more a kind of history of medicine kind of point than the kind of reading of novels that I've given so far. So this was a section that didn't get in my book because it was too historical and too biographical. Basically, it's gossip, but I liked it, and so I wanted to tell somebody about it. So we've got a photo here. Woolf's teeth. Woolf had 3 maxillary teeth removed on the 26th of May, 1922, at the age of 40, and she had a partial denture fitted to fill the gap afterwards, writing in her diary, the 7th of January, 1923, that upon hearing voices at night, quote, I jumped up, thrust in my upper teeth and opened the door. There's a mental image for you. Now, the reason for these extractions, the thing that excited me, is both interesting and intriguing. I should say I chose this photo because it's one of Woolf when she was younger, and we can see her teeth. She's late 20s here, and yeah, she's playing on the beach with Clive Bell. So while Woolf's diary records numerous instances of toothache through the years and visits to her dentist, who's called Mr. Harrison, these 3 teeth that she had removed in 1922 were different. They weren't chipped, cracked, carried, crooked, abscessed, or even sore. They weren't even sore. So neither was this the first part of a plan to do what T.S. Eliot's Lil says in The Wasteland about getting them all out and getting yourself a nice set. So Wolf's teeth were extracted in order to lower her temperature. That's right, to lower her temperature. So this high temperature had accompanied a racing heart and impaired breathing in an undiagnosed condition that had persisted since the beginning of that year. So if we follow this lead, I think we get what Leonard Wolf described as a fairly long odyssey through Harley Street and Wimpole Street, which will give us a curious view of medical science and the tip-top Harley Street specialists. So I hope you can indulge my left field interests here. The theory underpinning the removal of Wolf's teeth is that of what was called oral and then later focal sepsis. And this posited that teeth were foci or reservoirs for infections that could afflict the wider organism. Wolf puts the matter directly in a letter to her friend Carr Arnold Forster. I realised today, talking to a friend, that she is Carr Arnold Forster's great-granddaughter. There's one of those things. Wolf writes to Carr Arnold Forster, I got it, I got influenza, back again 3 weeks ago. So she got it again 3 weeks ago. Then they said there must be germs at the root of your teeth. So this theory posited that the patient's influenza had only ever apparently gone, and it was in fact hidden, latent underneath the teeth. The teeth themselves might be fine, but underneath them, there's this sort of focus of bacteria, and these can cause all kinds of other problems. Even problems far removed from the jaw. Now we can corroborate the widespread influence of this theory at this very particular historical moment, 1921 through to 23, say, because on the 23rd of April, on April 1923, James Joyce had all of his teeth taken out on the advice of his doctors, who saw them as, quote, a source of infection for his recurring iritis. So Joyce was notoriously, had notoriously bad vision, and they took his teeth out because they alleged that the problems with his eyes were being caused by germs underneath his teeth. I know, it's pretty wild. So this sepsis theory is what I think of as germ theory's revenge. It explains lots of different conditions that had previously been attributed to causes like nervous susceptibility and heredity. And it was used to rationalize symptoms as diverse as headaches, rheumatism, tuberculosis, fevers, and mental illness. So bad teeth, so the belief went, could make you mad. So as the systemic idea of sepsis makes clear, Wolf's 1922 extractions were performed by her doctor. Her dentist was apparently uninvolved here. Mr. Harrison wouldn't have done this, I suspect. So this theory arrives in Britain in after the war. There was some signs of it being around in the period before the war, but it comes back with a vengeance in the period immediately following the war. And when it arrives, it's very much dressed in the stars and stripes, I'm afraid. Even in the British medical journals, it's being discussed by Americans. So we find William Duke from Kansas writing a book explaining headaches via oral sepsis. And we get Charles Mills of Philadelphia, who addresses a further condition, says the question of dental infection in the production of nervous and mental diseases. And Mills laments that literally bushels of teeth of excellent quality have been sacrificed because of a newspaper article that attributed the death of Theodore Roosevelt to complications from an infected tooth. Everyone hears that Roosevelt dies because of some kind of infection that had been missed, and then everybody wants their teeth taken out because we don't want to go like Roosevelt did. He also identifies Henry A. Cotton from New Jersey as the key proponent of oral sepsis, the movement at the time. Under Cotton's jurisdiction, what starts off as oral sepsis, i.e. it's always something under your teeth, becomes focal sepsis more generally, and the reservoirs can be found elsewhere, these foci. So Mills relates this development with a slightly macabre surgeon's sense of humour. So I'm just going to go back because that wasn't on the PowerPoint. Yeah, a slightly macabre sense of humour. He says, under the influence of the propaganda of focal infection, to use the expression of Dr. Peterson, the colons of epileptics have bid fair to be reduced to semicolons by operation. The appendix will soon no longer be a vestigial illustration, and the tonsil, protrusive and submerged, is sharing the fate of the ovary in our early experience. Now, these rather awkward puns between bodily and writerly terminology, the colon turning into the semicolon, and referencing the popularity of tonsillectomies and ovariotomies, are in our present context uncomfortably apt and shadow Woolf's own later description of her exhausted, wounded mind in her diary, where she says, "My mind is like a gum when an aching tooth has been drawn." Now, while Woolf believed her teeth were removed in order to lower her temperature, as I've suggested, Mill's article raises another possibility that seems to have been unknown to Woolf herself, that her teeth were the cause of her periodic insanity, which was generally diagnosed as neurasthenia. Now, Woolf's biographer, Hermione Lee, was among the first to observe this connection, not least because it was Woolf's own doctor, Sir George Savage, consulted during periods of insanity prior to her marriage, who had linked oral sepsis and mental illness in a paper as early as 1876. It turns out, though, that he wasn't enamored with this theory. He persisted with the idea that insanity was principally something that you inherited, or it was to do with weak nerves. And this was what Woolf believed as well. So she writes to a friend that how I wish my ancestors had hunted and fished instead, i.e. they were all too bookish. If only they'd spent more time being robust outdoors, then she wouldn't have had these bouts of mental illness. So Woolf's diary evokes the kind of horrid medical paternalism that we might also recognise from mental illness. So on the 16th of August 1922, she says to a friend, this is her diary. "I see I have said nothing about our day in London, Dr. Sainsbury, Dr. Ferguson, and the semi-legal discussion over my body, which ended in a bottle of quinine pills and a box of lozenges and a brush to varnish my throat with. Influenza and pneumonia germs, perhaps," says Sainsbury. "Equanimity, practice equanimity, Mrs. Woolf," he said as I left. An unnecessary interview from my point of view, but we were forced into it by one step after another on the part of the bacteriologists. It's noticeable that it's bacteriologists, i.e. scientists, rather than the general practitioners or dentists that are driving this. So the semi-legal discussion over my body is powerfully reminiscent not only of patronising professional expertise, but the specific and very much gendered form of care associated with madness, familiar to contemporary readers of medical history maybe. Now, the doctor's advocacy of emotional self-control here, equanimity, Mrs. Woolf, implies that Woolf's condition is an emotional failure as much as a kind of infection. So the persistent idea that the mentally ill have suffered a kind of collapse of will or a failure of morals seems to underpin a recommendation that would seem to have little relation to infection. Indeed, in his autobiography, Leonard observes the dubious coupling of physical symptoms with psychological self-control. This is Leonard's version of this. He says, "The doctor might just have usually said, 'A normal temperature, 98.4. Practice a normal temperature, Mrs. Woolf.' It's that stupid," he thinks. So while both Savage and Woolf herself saw her persistent mental illness as the result of weakened family stock, it was not the only view of it wasn't the view of the doctors that were being consulted at this particular spell, 1922. Rather, in 1922, which is the year that Savage had actually died, and around a decade since his dismissal by Leonard, who thought that he was very bad, Wolf's new doctors were treating a bacterial infection that exhibited a wide range of systemic manifestations. Now, I've got no evidence that they were treating her mental illness. She wasn't showing signs of psychosis or anything like that at that moment. It seems to me that the most likely diagnostic rationale here is that somebody who has a condition that apparently can't be treated, and it has all kinds of different symptoms, from occasionally toothache to headaches to a racing heart to problems breathing. If you know that she's also got mental illness or has had periods of mental illness as well, this latest theory, i.e. the focal or oral sepsis theory, would seem like the kind of Occam's razor. It's the simplest explanation. Surely somebody like this has just got these reservoirs of infection that she doesn't know about. So Wolf's letters to Janet Case, I think, record the strategies of a medical field growing in confidence. So, oh yeah, that was the section 9. Sorry, I've just put these in the wrong order. Writing to Janet Case on the 21st of May 1922, Wolf says, "The doctor now thinks my influenza germs may have collected at the roots of 3 teeth. So I'm having them out and preparing for the escape of microbes, i.e. their release into the body, by having 65 million dead ones injected into my arm daily. It sounds to me too vague to be very hopeful, but one must, I suppose, do as they say." So this is a kind of dual therapy here, the idea of an attenuated inoculation, that we get a weakened or a dead version, is of course like that. This is vaccination 101, and something that we're all really familiar with now. But here it's being used in conjunction with this idea of releasing what is a latent infection in the body that's being found elsewhere. But a week later, she writes again to Case, "I'm so cross. 3 teeth pulled out that might have lasted a lifetime, and temperature still up. Next, they'll cut out my tonsils, and then I suppose adenoids, and then appendix, and then what comes next?" I think there's a suggestion there about ovariotomies. I think that's what's being implied here. So it turns out that she thought that the teeth were perfectly fine, and they'd been sacrificed to no apparent effect. The temperature did not lower, because of course this is just wrong. This is not. This is a theory which is incorrect. But Wolf's worrying list of body parts there, what comes next, as I say, notes that there is that this prevailing idea had really begun to kind of spread beyond the mouth. It wasn't just what's lurking under the teeth that's dangerous. And this is where we go back to Henry Cotton, the man from Trenton, New Jersey. So he was based at the New Jersey State Hospital, and he was medical director there from 1907. And he had there a group of literally captive research subjects upon which to practice his new science of what he called surgical bacteriology. Oops. I'll just move that forward. Yep. Surgical bacteriology. So as well as targeting teeth and tonsils, he also saw potential dangers scattered in reservoirs of bacteria throughout the body more widely. So this is a particularly upsetting poster, I think, because it says we might also find these same reservoirs in the mastoid, tonsil frontal sinus, antrum, gold cap filling, root abscess, stomach, gallbladder, transverse colon, ascending colon, sacrum, appendix, ileum, duodenum, descending colon, sigmoid cervix, and the seminal vesicles and the rectum. And to that already very abundant list, we might supplement further suggestions in another man's book, Focal Infection, the Lane Medical Lectures from 1916, the finger and toenails, bronchi, genitourinary tract. So while dental extractions were undoubtedly unpleasant, under this suspicious gaze, Cotton's patients in Trenton were subject to kind of serious abdominal surgery, and they had a mortality rate of over 50%. And he was cutting bits out of them in the belief that this would make them well, that this would cure their madness. Now, a New Jersey asylum psychiatrist's outlandish and seemingly wacky ideas seem pretty remote from Wolf's treatment in Harley Street. This is the best treatment that the British medical establishment can give. But it turns out that Cotton's agenda-setting series of Princeton University lectures, The Defective, Delinquent and Insane, the relation of focal infections to their causation, treatment and prevention, was published not only by Princeton University Press, but also in 1921, i.e. the year before Wolf has her treatment, by Oxford University Press, an august press. Not everything that they publish, I have to say, is full of such nonsense, but it's a bit close to home, this one. And in these lectures, he cites none other than George Savage, that is Wolf's former doctor, as an important source for his ideas. And it turns out that Cotton himself visited London in summer 1923 to promote his theories, and he was rapturously received by the medical establishment, exactly the doctors who are working in Harley Street and Wimpole Street. And the flattery offered to the American guest was reciprocated as Cotton made abundantly clear his belief in what he said were the British origins of the doctrine of focal infection. Now all of this flattery just seems hugely uncomfortable. It's like passing something which is this toxic idea that, oh no, you were the ones that came up with this wacky idea that's caused me to cut out the rectums of mental patients. No, it was you. No wonder, yeah, that doesn't read as it did at the time. So this story of him coming to Britain and giving this theory to all of the august authorities in Harley Street, I think brings us much closer back to the treatment that Wolf gets, where she's explicitly taken to specialists, the people who have the latest ideas in the field, and then essentially Wolf's desperate for some kind of novel treatment because she can't get rid of this temperature erasing heart. And so what do? You look for new ideas. So these are probably the people who would be most likely to have heard this theory or to be aware of Cotton. So it's quite a wonder, just to wrap up quickly, it's quite a wonder with all of this in mind that On Being Ill managed to find anything much positive to say about dentistry at all. Much less that only a year later, in 1923, we get one of the very rare pictures of Wolf giving a toothy smile in a garden with Lytton Strachey. There she is. So I'm going to stop here with this photo, which I think is not only a happy ending after a rather horrifying delve into medical history, but is also, I think, a really good antidote or prevention for the idea of Wolf as a melancholy or tragic author, and instead somebody who was charming, funny, witty, irreverent. And I think this is as fair a representation of an author as I can find. So there she is. This photo is particularly sad for me because I always imagine it. My office is now in London, which I haven't visited for getting on for 11 months, are in the buildings that the Bloomsbury Group first met in Gordon Square in Bloomsbury itself. And I picture this as the kind of thing that would take place in the garden that we have just outside. Yeah, so my not having been there for a long time because of an epidemic, I think is particularly poignant looking at that picture. So I'm just going to stop sharing there and go back to Zoom. Okay. I'm just going to look at Q&A. So Carolyn says, oh, the English in their teeth. Oscar Wilde had very bad teeth. That explains so much. Yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, I guess all I can say in mitigation, and it's only half mitigation, that I guess Oscar Wilde and James Joyce's teeth, we can say, oh, this is an Irish affliction as much. But of course, both Joyce and Wilde had British passports. So I mean, this is not an attempt to claim for the British, these two authors, but I don't think they form the escape or excuse that I might otherwise hope that would preserve my modesty. Yeah, so that's all of the material that I'd prepared. So I'm happy to stop there. But if there are more questions generally about things that I've talked about, points that people would like to make about reading Woolf or about perhaps reading Maxwell, then go ahead. It would be nice to hear from you. And also, if you feel like I've not answered questions that you've asked, then repose them. There is no silence quite so profound as a Zoom silence, is there? Oh, there's Cheryl's face. That's reassuring.
Peter, because I have the option, I think I'll just ask you a question. I want to join those that have already commented. This has been fascinating. And because I'm precisely working in this field and writing, and I'm just getting done reviewing Modernism and Physical Illness, which is a book that I would also recommend to our participants, which is not something I can generally do with scholarly books. It's a good read, and both, just like this talk, an interesting look at our history. I'm so glad you got into teeth. Because I've had this theory that there is something really profound about modernists and teeth. And I just don't bring it up because I have so much trouble with mine. It was my own obsession. However, you make this excellent point about Joyce and Woolf. And Dorothy Richardson's main character works in a dentist's office. And I remember when I started reading the novel, I was just like, this has to be a modernist novel because we would never have the point of view of a dental hygienist.
Absolutely, yeah. So some of the quotations that I was taking from the medics there, the way that I stumbled on these was because I was reading the Dental Record, which was the trade journal that Dorothy Richardson was publishing in, and preparing material for. So yeah, the argument which I slightly downplayed. There's a big argument about the authority of dentists versus doctors. That basically it's the doctors who start taking teeth out in order to cure people's madness and headaches. Dentists don't seem to be especially interested, but a part of that argument is about who's in charge. So yeah, I think it's a really good topic. And when I first started reading about the focal sepsis theory, I started getting pain in my teeth, and I thought, this is just auto-suggestion. Like, this is one of those things that if I were reading about bad eyesight, then I'd start seeing blurry shapes. And it turns out I didn't. I actually had. I actually just had to have root canal.
Oh.
I mean, talk about dedication to your research. Yeah, that was traumatic. I can laugh about it now, but at the time it wasn't funny.
Yeah. Did they give you gas though?
They didn't give me gas. No. I mean,
they did Novocaine. I bet.
Yeah.
It's not enough. You can still hear what's going on.
You can hear it, and also like so one of the things that I think doesn't come across on Zoom is I'm very tall. I'm a big man. I'm 6'7".
Oh my God.
So I'm big, and I have big teeth, and I have big roots. And so that feeling of them kind of delving down, it was like some kind of caving expedition. It was grotesque. I thought, this is oh yeah, hideous. Anyway, I just wanted to pick up a couple of the Q&As because Carolyn has said the stuff on cotton is so bizarre. Who knew? A lot of my knowledge about cotton came from a book by that somebody has written all about cotton and the Trenton Asylum. Now, can I find who it was? It's a historian of madness. Let's have a... The name has gone from my mind, but Andrew Scull, Scull. You couldn't make it up. I bought a book the other day that was about neurology and literature by somebody called Brain, and here we have a book about teeth, or with a story about teeth by someone called Andrew Scull. Yeah, Scull, called Desperate Remedies. Yeah, so that's where a lot of my stuff came from, and that's an interesting read. Yeah. Root canal during a solidarity on the root canal trouble. Okay, that was, yeah, I'm pleased I could answer that because I found it a really good stroke horrifying read. Oh, I should say thank you for making me or inviting me to read the Maxwell as well. I found it wonderful. I thought it was a stunning book.
Yeah, I was pretty surprised by this book. I was very interested in the three-part structure. I was fascinated by your comparison to The Lighthouse. That was fantastic. When I was reading it, I was finding all these common points as well. But
Yeah.
as a wolf scholar, I was like, you're probably seeing lighthouses everywhere. So
I think it's there, isn't it?
it is there.
Yeah.
It's really, you're right. And I'd been thinking through just Maxwell's choices of beginning with money and the kind of retreat of sympathetic consciousness that happens as we move through time too. I mean, not just personality wise, but it's much easier to be sympathetic with a child's point of view just because they don't have the worldly experience that an adult does.
Yeah, I think it's really well balanced between that kind of sympathy and what might come across as a very sentimental angle. It would have been easy to make this story really sentimental, but I think those other viewpoints and, as you say, the withdrawal of sympathetic kind of consciousness, I think really saves the book from being soppy.
Right, exactly. Well, Peter, thank you so much. This was amazing, and it was delightful to just be here and hear this. It's really for such an odd subject. It's really invigorating. So thank you, and thanks to everyone that was able to stick around for the extra time. We've got this as a recording, so I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of requests to catch the end. But thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a great, I guess, evening.
Yeah, 8:30 on a Friday night. I think you can guess what's next. That's going to be that's going to be a drink for the evening. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to everybody who came along as well. Although I can't see you, it's wonderful to have an audience. And I'm only sorry that I'm not there in person, but maybe one day. Okay. Bye, Marlena.